to welcome all of you here from, it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4 different continents to this live online meeting about publishing in the open, exploring pathways for open access publishing with our presenters, Associate Professor Laura Czierniewicz, University of Cape Town, and Dr. Maha Bali from the American University in Cairo. Open access publishing is becoming an increasingly contemporary and even urgent issue given the controversies around some of the profit-making policies of the proprietary journal groups and the question of whether academics and scholarly communities really have any control over what happens to the work of their members and the ability to really get the work disseminated widely. Without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Laura and to Maha.
Hey, greetings to everyone. We do have some slides, although Maha and I have agreed that we'd really prefer discussion. But when we had a look and to see who was here, we realized it was a very diverse group. So we're going to go over some of the basics. And for those of you who are familiar with these concepts, please do join in. We welcome that. So just to put a little bit of context, we're all familiar with the fact that it's an extremely unequal world that we live in. This is one of my favorite cartoons with this Kofi Annan handing over to Ban Ki-moon, this extremely unbalanced north-south world where the global north really has dominance around knowledge production and the global south is largely invisible. At the same time, we are all deeply familiar with the extraordinarily high costs of proprietary journals, and every year there's a periodicals price survey that comes out that maps the cost of these prices. And here's the latest one, $5,000 for a chemistry journal. And we all know, of course, that the individual articles for 24 hours, etc., are insanely expensive. And there was a wonderful moment, which is now a good 14, 15 years ago, where the Budapest Open Access Initiative was launched, less than 2 decades ago, and premised on the belief that an old tradition and a new technology make possible an unprecedented public good. That is, I think, the first time, and I see Eve Grave here, she'll be able to correct me if I'm wrong, that the word and the term open access was used, open access publishing. So just a quick run through. Open access publishing are scholarly resources that are free of charge to the reader and which are supported by open licenses. And although you'll find very often that people talk about journals, in fact it can refer to all scholarly content. So let's not link only to journals. There are 2 main kinds. Despite what many publishers would like to have us believe, there are 2 main kinds. And the green route is the route of self-archiving. So this is the route where a preprint or a postprint of an article or some kind of output can be put into an institutional repository or a subject repository or on a department website. So it's an archiving of a version. It's very rarely the final version of record. And the way to check which version and what the conditions are to look on Sherpa Romeo. It was interesting when I was preparing for this talk and running over some of just having a look at some of the background, I came across this very interesting blog on green open access publishing and how much more complicated it's become. So for those who are interested, have a look at this link that's provided here. The publishers have really made it much more difficult than it used to be, but it's still a route that that I would recommend highly people follow. And then, of course, there's the gold route, gold open access. And this is publishing in open access journals. And there are lots of different kinds. There are commercial open access journals, the most famous of which probably is the PLOS, the Public Library of Science. There are lots and lots of society open access journals, and there are university open access journals. And there's been a rapid growth of open access journals. The percentage, or total percentage of scholarly publishing is very high. I forget the actual number. It certainly must be as much as a third, I think, now. And despite what most people think, most of them don't charge article processing charges. There's an excellent publication that's recently come out on gold open access journals over the last 4 years, which once again I would recommend highly. Maha, are you going to talk about say a little bit more about the types of journals and publications?
Yeah. So just following on from what Laura said, and that there are some journals that are completely open access in this, and free to the author. So all the articles are open access, and the author does not pay author processing fees. And those are the ones that I generally go for, and those are sometimes supported by university or other public institutions, possibly not by commercial publishers. But there are ones that are supported by traditional commercial publishers. Some of them do involve author processing fees, but the key thing there to keep in mind is that some of the publishers will waive or reduce fees for developing countries. So if you're in a situation where your department really cares about you publishing in very particular journals, because some fields are like that, check out if that journal or that publisher will waive your author processing fee if you want to. And of course, also check Sherpa Romeo to see if you could provide an open access version of it via the green route. And some journals will allow you to put it immediately available, and some of them will give you an embargo period of 1 year or 2 years before you can share your thing on your own website. And sometimes on your own website it becomes more available, or more quickly available, but not on an institutional repository, for example. So the thing with the green route is that Google Scholar is very good at finding the open access versions, but if people go through traditional libraries or very traditional ways of finding articles, they won't know that there's an open access version of your article. So if there is ever a way for you to make it available directly on the journal website, either because it's just a generally open access, free to you journal, or if you could do a gold option without paying author processing fees, that would be great. Yeah, for myself, as someone from a developing country, I would not take grant money to pay for author processing fees if I could possibly publish in an open access journal that doesn't ask for them. I think it's a waste of our money. We could be using it doing something more useful. And then so what would happen is that you would have a journal that would have some of its content open access and some of it not, depending on whether people ask for that or not. So it's just something to keep in mind. And so what we're going to do next is hopefully interactively answer one of the questions several of you had on the forum, which is about judging the quality and credibility of open access journals. But before I go to the next slide, I just want to ask you in general, how do you decide which journal to publish in? So not whether it's open access or not, but in the first place, when you want to publish something, what are some of the first things you think about? Maybe you could write that down in the chat. I'm going to also write. So Nicola thinks a little bit like me about people you know and respect have published there. When I was younger, still doing my master's, it would be, authors that my tutors had recommended, right? And so those would be the people I trust. Until then, as you become more familiar with the field, you start to know who the key people in the field are and where they publish. The thing about impact rates is, it's not, for me personally, and I think Laura maybe could speak to this a little bit more, but for me personally, the impact rate for journals that are about very specialist topics will never, I think, be very high, just because it's a very specialist thing. So if you publish in a very wide-ranging topic, maybe journals like in the sciences like Nature or whatever, those have very high impact factors. But if you're in a very, very niche field, I think that that ends up not having a big impact factor, but the audience reading it will be the audience that's most relevant to your work. And Laura, correct me if I'm wrong, and you could maybe add something here about what you do, how you judge.
So one of the things that's really important is to look at the editorial board. It's not just recognizing the authors to date. The editorial board should be well-known people in the field, experts. You should recognize some of the people in the field. But I'm wondering, Eve, are you here? Because I think this issue of impact factor is a really important thing worth commenting on. So I'm waiting for Eve because I know this is one of her particular issues and concerns, and I noticed that a number of people take the impact factor really seriously. Impact factors are something of a delusion, and they marginalize developing countries. So one of the things that I would suggest, yes, please do share anything you've published on this. It's really important. One of the things that I suggest is to have a look at the directory of open access journals. Because what's particularly interesting is if you have a look at their criteria, they do not include the impact factor. They find the impact factor so very problematic that they don't actually require or include the impact factor as one of their criteria.
I actually don't even know if the criteria are transparent. You know, it's kind of like those university rankings. Some person somewhere or some committee decided that certain criteria would be used, and then everyone just follows it, and you don't necessarily really know.
Are you talking about the impact factor or about the directory of open access journals, Maha?
About whether it's transparent to us what the criteria are. And even if they were transparent, they're still from some person's or committee's point of view. And so that point about marginalizing developing countries is very interesting to me. Because if there's a journal about Africa, of course there won't be a lot of people outside of Africa reading it, but it will be very relevant to people in Africa, right?
Yeah, and in fact we know that there's some interesting studies about who's actually publishing about Africa too. So I would recommend, yeah, I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but I would recommend that people have a look at the directory of open access journals. They went through a process earlier this year where everyone had to reapply. So they made their criteria very, very clear. And their criteria, for example, include article level metrics and measures. They include that you have to have an editorial board. It was a really interesting process, and I think it does mean that those journals are not predatory journals, because I know that people are very anxious about predatory journals, and the directory of open access journals is a safe place to identify open access journals.
Okay, shall we maybe move on to some of the emails that people might be getting? And maybe get people's response. If you get an email that looks like this one, which I actually did get, and because it was happening just ahead of this event, I kept saving these so that I can share them with you. What are some of the things about this that make it credible, and what are some of the things about it that make it less credible? And people could write that down in the comments. is there anything in it that makes it look a little bit credible, that would make you stop and say, well, maybe it is a credible journal, but just not a very good one? Because so there, I mean, there are journals that are, they do exist and everything. They're just not very good quality journals, but they're real, they're legit. So are there aspects to this one? Yes, ISSN, right? Of course, they could make it up. I mean, I assume that you could search and check. Sentence structures clumsy SK. I think that's always a bad sign, like when there are grammatical errors and so on. Yes, exactly. I agree. If they really want to make you feel like they're targeting you as a particular person, then they do want to be specific about what it is of the author's work that they are referring to. But that's a good point, Eve, about critiquing language if it's a journal of people who are not native speakers. It's a good point, but it's still, I think, something that journals still need to work on. I mean, I peer review a lot of work that is written by non-native speakers, and I tolerate reading it because I'm a non-native speaker and I can understand it because I make that effort. But a lot of native speakers don't tend to have the patience to go through an article that's like that, so I will read it and give it a review in terms of its content, but also suggest that the author have someone review it for language so that it can be readable to others and so that you can be clear. And so I think someone who is the editor of a journal at least should check the spelling and grammar of their, and I don't know what Eve and Laura and everyone else thinks, but that's what I think. I think at least the editor needs to be fluent enough to manage that. Unfortunately, most things are in English, and that's kind of a bias already, right? They're not publishing in their own language where they could do that. So Nagla is saying that even if a title of an article she wrote is mentioned, she still does not find it credible. I have to share a story at the end that I shared with Laura about one of these that turned out to be a real person and a real journal and a very good person who was just a new editor. And so
Maha, I think this is a good time to tell your story because, in fact, it's the way that you and I met.
Yes, it is. That's true, actually. So I received this email from someone with an Indian-sounding name, and so already, you know, unfortunately, there's a bias against that part of the world. And he's not Indian, actually, but that's the way his name sounded. And it had no subject. And automatically, when I see an email without a subject, I think that doesn't sound right. And he's inviting me to submit to a journal of his, and he's sending it to me from a Gmail address. And it's a journal I've never heard of before, and it's clearly an open access online journal that doesn't have a print version. And so I had just, I think, finished my PhD. I think the only reason I replied to him is that he was referring to a particular article of mine, and it was a field of expertise of mine, which was MOOCs from a developing country's perspective. So I said, you know, I responded, but I didn't say I was necessarily going to write for the journal. I said, I'll see if I have something for you before the deadline. I'm not sure if I'll have anything. And the only reason I actually ever got to know this person is that they found me writing something on Twitter about a particular MOOC, and they got into the discussion with me. And then I started to recognize that that might be a real person because he's actually having a conversation with me on Twitter. And then we went back to email, and we kept going back and forth. And he's a Nepalese professor who lives in the US, but he was a new editor to that journal, and so he was nervous when he was sending me the email, and that's why he forgot the subject, and the email wasn't written well. And he teaches rhetoric and composition, so his English is very good. It was not a matter of English, but it was just his style was strange. And I wrote for his journal, I've co-authored pieces with him, and I met Laura through him, who was also publishing an article in that journal, and we created together, the three of us and a few other people, edcontext.org. And that's a website where educators can educators from all over the world can write about educational topics from their own context as a way to counter the very high north-south content out there. And so we encourage people from everywhere, and everyone here is encouraged also to submit pieces there. You can go take a look at what we've published recently. And hopefully you'll want to submit for us as well. And this is not a peer-reviewed space. It's like a magazine or a trade publication type of thing. So we just edit it for language and so on. We don't actually we don't expect you to write research or whatever. It's just like blog post length type of thing. Okay, I'm going to move on from this one. What about this journal? What do you think of this journal? Yeah, isn't it? I think it's a very dodgy name. It's a very strange name. Again, broadnet. I agree with you. Well, the other one, I think the other one had very similar, like all the subfields of education. Yeah, I have no idea what they mean by onward. I think Laura had a comment on onward as a name. You were telling me last time we met, right? Yeah, 3 weeks
So
sounds
in
very
fact, Onward is actually a name of that I know in Zimbabwe. I know a couple of people called Onward. So as a person's name, it's an acceptable name. As the name of a journal, I think one might be doubtful. But once again, one needs to think carefully and not be judgmental based on particular, perhaps contextual basis.
I'm just going to move on to the same email, and this is the rest of it. This one, I think, was forwarded to me by Nicola, and for me, one of the main things that I thought was weird is at the very bottom it says best regards, but there's no signature. So as opposed to Cosmo Johnson, where he had his name in there and he had my name in there and he had the ISSN and all that, this one has dear colleagues, so it's sent to a broad range of people, but also best regards, and there's no name of a publisher. Of course, you could click that link and check the names, and there could be a list of names, but you have to follow through the names of the editor and the editorial board and check their affiliations and check that they're correct to know that it's a good journal. If you want to invest time to do that, but I didn't. Yeah, so Eve is saying the editorial board would be the real giveaway, and I think that's what Laura was saying earlier, and I agree with that. Usually, if I know of the editor or of at least a couple of people on the editorial board, that automatically makes me trust it. And it's true about the very, very fast peer review worker. The only journal where I've been able to publish very fast is Hybrid Pedagogy, because they have a very different peer review process than most. It's not double blind, and the editors are themselves the peer reviewers, so they don't have to search outside. But most journals, they take a while to find a peer reviewer who will agree to do it, and they don't usually do it very fast. 4 to 6 weeks is even optimistic. So yeah, 3 weeks is very short. They're probably either not real, or they're not doing good quality review, or they don't get a lot of papers, and that's why they can do it that fast. Yeah, they don't even, they're still seeking editors and reviewers, and that's an important point as well. That's a good point, Eve. So that's also very important. What if someone just lists names of real people on their editorial board? How would you check that? Would you actually go to their pages, their own CVs, and check if they have it listed? Or what would you do about that? Do some people actually do it? Actually, I mean, it would be a very devious thing to do. I wonder. Wow, write to them. Okay, especially if we know them. That's a good point. What happened to me recently, this is a different story, but I was asked, it was a very weird ask. I was asked by something called Biennial of Sydney, Australia, right? They asked me to write an article about, the digital or MOOCs or something from a developing world perspective. I'm like, what's that got to do with you? Biennial of Sydney, what's that got to do with me at all? But I talked to someone I know who's Australian, and she told me that it's a legit publication and so on. Someone I trusted. I mean, she wasn't on the editorial board or anything, but at least she could help me judge that. Okay, I'm going to move on from this. And Laura, you were just saying recently about DOAJ that the directory of open access journals have a vetting process now, and beforehand it wasn't, but now it's filtered. And I'm just saying about this using your judgment thing applies to open access and subscription journals. So just because a journal is a subscription journal doesn't mean it's good enough, and doesn't mean that you should publish there. And yeah, I'll leave Laura to say some last words about this and to the next.
Okay. So I suspect that I'm preaching to the converted, that in fact, one of the problems is that although open access is really a better idea, the reward systems that most people as scholars have to function in don't necessarily reward open access. But I think most people in developing countries and many scholars in developed countries really do want to make a contribution to development. So it's just a nice reminder having Obama talking about how doctors and professionals and people actually need access to the latest research. This is not just a nice to have, this is actually a life or death issue. And as I mentioned earlier and really would like to emphasize in this particular context, the real danger is that African universities and universities in developing countries tend to be consumers of knowledge and research, and we really need to be working very hard to overcome all the challenges in our way to make sure that our voices from developing countries are out there. And of course, this is essential for students. So there's a lot of student activity that points out that the minute you leave the university, your library card expires, your access to the databases goes away, and it makes it really difficult to be a lifelong learner if you're hooked into the subscription model. So, Maha, you wanted to talk about your PhD story at this point?
Yeah, sorry, I just forgot to unmute. I was talking without having my mic on. So this is a very developing world kind of story, because I was doing my PhD in Sheffield, the UK, so I had access to that library, but I was living here in Egypt. And here in Egypt, I have good internet at home. I have access to the library at the American University in Cairo electronically, but I was on maternity leave, so I couldn't go to the campus itself. And my supervisor asked me to, this is summer 2013, asked me to do some extensive changes to my methodology chapter, and a lot of the resources I needed were in books that were like handbooks of qualitative research that if I wanted to buy them on Kindle were $500, which I couldn't afford and my credit card wouldn't allow me to do. And 2013 is when a lot of political upheaval was happening in Egypt. So physically the libraries were closed, and I couldn't even actually, if someone I knew had the book, and that was the case, I couldn't even reach them to get the book from their house and take it for a while. And so what I remember happening at that time, and this is I think the time when I became converted to the idea of open access, is that I started to look for anywhere on the internet that had chapters of that book pirated and posted online so that I could get access to them. So going through that situation where you couldn't reach something, and then recognizing that whoever puts stuff available for you online, and this is not obviously the open access we're talking about, right? This is illegal probably. But also if more people made, not their book chapters, but maybe parts of their journal articles on repositories, I would have been able to find them, because a lot of chapters that are in books are also published in some form as articles in journals. And so if those chapters are published in some open access form or available on a repository, they would have saved me a lot of trouble and time searching, and I would have found, legal copies of these texts. And and this is me who had access to 2 libraries digitally. What about people who don't have that access? What about retired people? What about people in universities that don't have access to all these journals and who don't have librarians who can bring them articles that are missing and things like that? So this is why.
Okay, it's me again. I'm just reminding people that openness enables visibility. And in fact, being online and having one's work online has become really an essential part of being an academic nowadays. There's no way of getting away from that. If we don't take control of our visibility, our visibility takes control of us, or our digital shadow and digital footprint takes control of us. So Elmer Swan's written loads and loads about the open access advantages, which I'll just quickly run through. The general open access advantage, just because if your work is online and work is online, people have access who didn't have access before. The early advantage, so the earlier something is put out, the better. And we see lots and lots of cases of that nowadays, where early versions get put up and engaged with even before the version of record is out. There's a selection bias, which is that people tend to make their better articles available because there's much more sense of scrutiny. So in fact, the process is a quality assurance process in itself. And then that leads to the quality advantage. A lot of people's anxieties are a small readership, nobody will actually know. Hopefully a bigger readership, more people will get to read it, so make it better. And we've certainly seen that in the open education space, where you will all remember the MIT Open Courseware Initiative, which kick-started open education resources. They found that one of the unexpected outcomes of that project is that the quality of teaching resources improved as a result of them becoming more open. And it's known, there's some really interesting studies that open access improves your chances of citation. Spark Europe keeps a really nice running record of studies that look into the citation advantage on a regular basis. And if you're interested in that, have a look at this link at Spark Europe. They've got a table, and it shows you which disciplines show a citation advantage, what the citation advantage is, and those which show no citation advantage, because obviously some of these things are very, very discipline specific. So that's really, really fascinating to have a look at. The other thing that's particularly interesting is the fascinating study that was done that showed that the influence of free access on citations is twice as large for the poorer countries in the developing world compared to the richer countries as measured by GNI. So this is particularly advantageous for developing countries. And many of you will have seen this shocking, horrifying world map before. It never ceases to appall me when we look at the web of science as represented by the authors living there. There's such a dominance from the global north, and this can be interrogated and questioned and argued with in so many different ways. I would recommend going to this particular version. The link is there because it also shows it's animated, so you can look at how it's changed over time. And you can look, for example, at how the situation in Latin America has improved over time because of Cielo, which is an open access platform, which increasingly is used by Latin America, and which has improved their visibility online, which is really important. Another shocker is the way we see this closed loop of citations historically. So this is 2005, and you can really see how there's this closed loop between North America and Europe, and how we really want to get in there as developing country scholars and researchers and academics, so that we can actually break that closed loop and make it more open and include the global south. It really, really matters, and it particularly matters because most people are finding their scholarship and their research online. Increasingly, as connectivity improves and as infrastructure improves, scholars are going to Google Scholar as the #1 way of finding research. So this really matters. It's actually shaping the way knowledge is happening, and local knowledge really needs to get out there. It needs to be available to others in similar circumstances, and it needs to be a contribution to global knowledge. It's good for science, and we know that a knowledge production and dissemination system that sidelines 3/4 of the world is bad for everyone. So this is really important, and for people who are anxious about participating, I can only emphasize that we need to find ways of overcoming that anxiety. And we can talk about how we can do that. There's a fantastic organization called AuthorAid, AuthorAid, which is listed in our Google Doc that Maha's mentioned, that works with people in developing countries to be able to publish, to get the confidence, skills, competencies, etc., to get online. And it's really an important matter. It's not just about individuals, it's actually about global science, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. So open access, if you have a look at the way that various countries are starting to leverage the power of the internet, we really are seeing increasing numbers of open access publishing and policies, and this is a good thing. It's encouraging, but as I have been emphasizing, there is the danger that these open access policies that are coming into being all over the global north might have the danger of drowning out the scholarship from the global south, where we don't have policies with resources. And Maha, you made a couple of interesting comments at the beginning about where do we get the funds from to get online and to publish online and for research dissemination online. I think it's a really, really important question that I hope we'll talk about, and we'll talk about how can we actually do this. And then just to get back to a point somebody made earlier, and Frederick, you were talking about the need to have African journals and African studies. I read a really depressing study very recently about 2 top African studies journals. So this is the field of African studies, which did an analysis of these 2 journals between 1993 and 2013 and found that the percentage of articles by Africa-based authors has declined. And it's not because of lower submission rates, but because of lower acceptance rates into those journals, and also found that those scholars are systematically cited less than others. And that's really, really sobering. These are published in the global north. They're about Africa, and it's not a pretty picture, and it's something that we obviously need to do something about. So I think just to...
Laura,
yeah.
Just one second. I was just going to say that because of that acceptance rates problem, this is why I usually accept to do peer reviews of articles by non-native speakers, so that I can argue with the editor sometimes if I think a journal, an article needs to be given a chance to improve or whatever, because I'm always worried that scholars from the developing world or who are annual might not be as forgiving or as willing to be constructive and help the author and that kind of thing. Now, author aid should help with that. Like you'd be able to find a mentor who can help you with something like that. But I think those of us who have the power to be on editorial boards or to be reviewers have some power to help. For some reason, they always give me stuff by non-native speakers. Like, I don't know why, but there's a particular journal that always does that. And I try to make use of that to argue for them and give them an opportunity. So.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. And I think your point about being reviewers is really important. So it's not just about becoming researchers and writers, but to play a role reviewing. And there are calls fairly regularly for new reviewers for journals, and I think this is another way of influencing what gets published. Like you, Maha, I also find that I get a lot of articles that get sent my way about developing country contexts, which is a kind of mixed thing, because one would like to believe that we have something to say about a whole range of contexts, but I think it is an opportunity to get involved and to get a sense of various fields. Maha, at this point, you wanted to talk about the Egyptian Knowledge Bank, which I think is a...
Yeah, I'm not really sure if anyone here has heard of this. I know Nicola and Jacob were here in Cairo for the e-Learning Africa conference, and it was mentioned there. Basically, what's happened here is that we have a committee that's working with the Egyptian government that made a deal with quite a big number of publishers. So Kate has heard of it, okay. To give access to all Egyptians, anyone with Egyptian identity card and IP address, to have access to a big range of journals and books and so on from particular publishers that they agreed with, and they agreed with a lot of publishers, like I think Elsevier, probably Taylor and Francis, quite a few of those. And the logic behind it is that Egyptian universities don't all have equal access. So my university, the American University in Cairo, has a lot of money relatively and has a lot of access versus some of the national public universities. Some of them have access and some of them don't. They don't always pay it every year and things like that. So I just wanted to get a quick reaction from people, whether you've heard it before or if you've just heard about it from me. So the first question is people ask, can we extend this to other African universities? And some Arab countries have also asked. And I think they are willing to have this kind of negotiation, but I have a couple of ethical problems with it, but I just want to hear what other people say. But it's definitely doing something, right? At least it's equalizing access to that research to all Egyptians. Does it really give access to all Egyptians? I'm challenging that. I'm waiting because Kate is typing something, and and Frederick is also typing. I'm not sure what you mean, Frederick, in saying we should just go ahead building our own alternatives, otherwise we will be buying temporary time. Gabriel is saying language is a huge problem in many journals and books, and that's a huge problem with this Egyptian knowledge bank, is that most of the content is in English. Egypt has about a 50% literacy rate and a 50% internet penetration rate. So that's already half the population that doesn't read or write, and half the population that doesn't have internet. So those are excluded. I'm assuming that the half that have internet access are the same half that can read, which makes sense, right? But other people who can read the language, how many people can read English? How many people are scholars who would read the scholarly journals? There's material for children's books and stuff as well, but how many people are literate enough beyond being able to read and write to be able to access this material, even if it was available in Arabic or in some other language? So Kate is saying she saw an example in the creative writing field where a publishing house co-sponsored a mentoring program for editors. Right. Okay. All right, so you're talking about writing and editing and mentoring that. So you're not talking about the Egyptian knowledge bank. Yeah. So Eve is saying that there's a trap here. Access by favor, access that can be withdrawn. We need to have ownership of access, not by grace and favor. So Eve, when you're saying that, you mean what by grace and favor? Yeah, Frederick, I've heard of Hindawi too. I think they're legitimate, but I don't know about the quality of the journals that they publish. It's an Egyptian-American publisher of open access journals. Hey, Eve, why are some countries not allowed access to Hindawi? I don't know. Yeah. So, I mean, I brought up the Egyptian Knowledge Bank because I thought that some people would think it solves some of the open access problems, and it does solve some of them in terms of consumption of some content for some privileged people who would be able to benefit from it. But I think I would rather have advocated for publishers to allow authors from this part of the world to publish all of their work open access, and to have special access rights in general, not for Egypt specifically, and to help what we produce to also be open access, not just what we receive. Okay, I'm going to stop here talking about the Egyptian Knowledge Bank, and I've been looking at the questions. I think we've answered all the questions on the forum, but if anyone has any other questions.
Can I just say something before we open up some more? Frederick has been saying a couple of times now we need to be starting our own journals, and I think that's a really powerful point. I thought I would mention an example here in South Africa where that's been done. There is something, I'm about to put it down, something called Critical Studies in Teaching and Learning, which is a new journal that's been opened here. It's an open access journal, and it will go through the whole process of, getting accredited and put onto some lists and so on. It's a lot of work. I think you really do need a community to come together and decide to make it work, but I think that's a great idea if it's possible.
think with local journals, one of the issues is building the reputation, right? Is finding really good scholars in the field who are local or regional, but who have an international reputation, so that, again, when you go and look at the editorial boards, you really feel like, yes, these are legitimate people, and right? Because what happens is that people like Laura and myself, we are on editorial boards of international journals, right? And so we have a lot of that experience, and then maybe we're able to be editors or editorial board members of local or regional journals, and then we bring that experience back, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't underestimate how much work it is. Okay, our last questions, we seem to have had fairly interactive sessions, so there have been a lot of discussions along the way. Last questions? Last comments?
Laura and Maha, I really want to thank you for a most comprehensive and truly interactive mode of engagement. This was far more than just a presentation. Really good example of how to use the affordances of a webinar for engaging a wide group of people. And I'd like to ask people here if you can enter your closing comments and reflections and possibly even some questions into the text chat now, and we can use that to lead us into the next phase of discussion in the forum. So please enter your closing comments and reflections in the text chat. Thanks.
I really like what Frederick has shared here, and also what Jakob was saying about the modern academic needing to engage with open access. And the thing is, if we really care about our research being used, regardless of even peer-reviewed publications, I think it's very useful to publish in non-peer-reviewed spaces if we have time and affordance to do that in ways that are accessible to the public as well. So not necessarily even to people who are in our own specialty, but maybe a broader audience. if we want to, for example, improve health literacy, then people who are sick or have sick children need to have access to medical knowledge that isn't written in medical jargon. And I know that a lot of institutions don't actually reward that, but if we have opportunities to do it, this is one of the things that would be really, really useful, rather than leaving it to journalists who don't necessarily understand the science so well and might misunderstand what we do.
You've got a couple of links here, the forum, which is an ongoing discussion, and the Google Doc, which is open to everyone. We've added some more references there, some more links, some papers you might find interesting, and we've made it so that everyone can edit, so please do. This is very much an ongoing conversation. It's certainly a battle that we have to keep fighting.
Well, thank you very much to everybody here, to Laura, to Maha, to all the participants who are taking such an active role. And I can a real sense of engagement, far more than I've seen in many webinars, and that this is a hot issue for probably all of us here. Lots to take forward, lots of conversation going on in the background about what can the AU do about this. Debates about whether it makes sense to contribute to existing open access journals or to start our own on this continent. Please come and join us in the forums. We currently have topics for sharing your experiences around open access publishing and for your hot questions. And we're open to starting new topics as required, and you can even start your own topic in the forum about an issue that you'd like to get engagement from others in this seminar about. There were in total about 23, 24 of us in this webinar, but there are dozens of other people who I think could be drawn into the forums as well, so this could turn out to be a very lively rest of the week. And I have a sense that this topic is full of possibilities for engagement, for creativity. So again, really warm thanks to our presenters, and looking forward to continuing the conversation with you in the forums and in the Google Doc. Thank you all.